As we reflect today on the Epiphany and the journey of the Magi, I think a good question for us to ask is, what was the point of this long and dangerous journey that the Magi went on? And it says in the Gospel that they came to do Him homage, to prostrate themselves before Him. The purpose of this entire journey and why they traveled so many miles across so many different nations and braved many different dangers was so that they could bow down in adoration before the Christ child. Their purpose wasn't to get anything in return. They were doing this simply to adore the King of Kings. Often, people who don't go to Mass or, people who say they don't like being at Mass, one of the things that they'll say is, well, I don't get anything out of it. I'm sure many of us have heard someone say that. Well, the whole point of the Mass is not to get anything out of it. That's not why we're here. That's kind of missing the whole point. The Mass is not about indulging ourselves. If we want to be entertained, then we should go watch a movie or, go watch a sports game. Or if we want to enjoy a good meal, we go to a restaurant. The Mass is not primarily about getting something for ourselves. And if that's what we're seeking, we're in entirely the wrong mindset. The purpose of the Mass is to give worship and adoration to God. And the Mass is actually the perfect act of worship, because it's the action instituted by Jesus Christ to glorify and to give honor to His Heavenly Father. So there is no other act of worship that's fitting and as perfect as the Mass. And what worship involves is delighting in someone else, in our Heavenly Father. And I was thinking of an analogy. I spent a couple days in the Smoky Mountains last year. And there's, various scenic overlooks and, it's just incredibly beautiful places where you can see for miles and miles and, you can see the smaller mountains around you and you can see the rivers flowing through and, all the different trees. And there's just a sense of the grandeur and the beauty of creation. I'm sure many of us have experienced a moment like that. If we can see the beauty of creation at a moment like that, how much greater is the beauty of the Creator, the one who designed all of these things and willed them and they came into existence. The one who is infinitely powerful and whose wisdom guides all of creation, and the one who in His mercy entered into human history and became one of us in order to save us. If we can see the beauty of creation and delight in that, how much more should we delight in the beauty of the Creator, whose presence we enter into every time we come to Mass? In one sense, worship is the most unproductive thing that we can do with our time, because we don't get any tangible material benefits from it. We don't produce anything that's useful, like if we go out and grow some crops or something. But in another sense, worship is the highest action that we as human beings are capable of, because it's centered on the highest good, on God Himself, rather than a lesser good. We're not doing something that simply is utilitarian for our own benefit. We're making something for our good. At Mass, we're focused on the highest good that there is, which is God Himself, and delighting in giving honor to Him. Our ability to worship is often limited by a couple things. The first thing that it can be limited by is the limitations on our own intellect. We don't see very clearly whose presence we're in. We might stroll into church casually and not think much of it. The angels are not that way. The way angelic intellects work, they know God to the fullest extent of their ability at every moment. So when angels come into the presence of God, they know whose presence they're in, and they fall down in worship and adoration and give Him homage, because they see very clearly who God is. We often don't do that. And so we have to make the act intellectually where we affirm whose presence we're in. Like, who is it that is in the Eucharist? This is the God of all creation. We have to call that to mind. And we have to work to train our intellects and to expand our intellects. Because whatever image we have of God, our image of God is too small. There is no way that we can fully comprehend the infinite God within our finite intellects. And so we have to call to mind whose presence we're in, and we have to expand our intellect by reflecting upon the majesty of who God is, so we can begin to see more clearly whose presence we're entering into. The second obstacle to worship of God can be our own selfishness. That was King Herod's issue. He heard that there was a newborn king, and what was his response? Well, he wanted to kill the Christ child so he could cling to his own throne. So he was clearly not in any position to be worshiping because of his own selfishness. And so too, if we're focused only on what we can get from worship, then we're not going to have the right disposition to be able to worship at all. And so worship requires us to be selfless, to step beyond our own needs and desires, and to be able to delight in God because of who He is and because of His majesty. So it calls on us to step beyond ourselves and to recognize His glory and majesty and to delight in that. When we approach worship, we shouldn't be doing it to get something out of it, but at the same time, proper worship is actually the most beneficial thing that we can possibly do, because it's the highest action that we can do as human beings. It elevates the purpose of our lives when we're centered not on our own needs, but on the adoration of God. And it also builds virtue, because it is just for us, meaning it is appropriate and it is a responsibility that we have to give thanks to God for having created us and for giving us everything. So to not worship God would be unjust. It would be an act of injustice. To worship God is right and just. And so by worshiping God, it builds virtue within us. And the highest virtue is love. We should ultimately worship God not just because it is right and it is just, but we love Him and we desire to worship Him. And so, the worship and adoration of God can be very beneficial in building virtue within us and helping to elevate and purify our lives. Just like the Magi brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, anytime we come into the Lord's presence, we should offer Him something. And that's part of worship as well, is our self-offering. And one of the ways that we do that is, of course, financial contributions, the fruit of our labor. But more importantly, in terms of self-offering, are the sacrifices that we make to live a life of virtue. That requires us sacrificing our own desires if they're leading us to sin, and saying no so that we can be obedient to God's will. Those are the interior penances, the sacrifices that we make, the self-offerings that we can bring before the Lord that are beautiful gifts in His eyes. So I encourage us as we come before the Lord to delight in His majesty and also to make the self-offering, all the sacrifices that we've made to serve the Lord, the time we've spent in prayer, to bring those as gifts before His throne. The Magi traveled long distances to give homage to Jesus Christ. We didn't have to travel long distances to get here, but the homage that we give should be just as deep and just as pure, because we are in the presence of the same Lord that the Magi entered the presence of. And so as we continue with this Mass, we fall on our knees before the Lord, and we give Him adoration and homage with our whole hearts, and we delight in the presence of a God who is so good, and we should be joyful to be privileged to be here, and to be so fortunate as to know Jesus Christ, and to be able to partake in this heavenly banquet.